I thought the strangest thing that could happen during a night shift in a Las Vegas casino was watching someone lose $1 million in 30 seconds. But that was before a man walked in and quietly decided to spend $100 million just to change my life. The rain tapped softly against the tall glass walls of the casino that night, turning the neon lights of the strip into blurry rivers of red and gold outside. And inside, the air smelled like polished marble, expensive cologne, and the faint sweetness of bourbon drifting from the high-stakes tables. My name is Olivia Bennett, 26 years old, cocktail server, part-time student, and the kind of woman who usually disappears into the background of a place like this. My shift had started at 7 p.m., heels already aching by 9, balancing trays of crystal glasses while men in tailored suits and women wrapped in diamonds pretended that money was just another game. At table 12, the real game was happening. A private poker table tucked beneath a chandelier that looked like it belonged in a palace rather than a casino floor. The players there didn't laugh loudly like the tourists. They spoke quietly, calmly, the way people do when every chip on the table could buy a house somewhere in America. I wasn't supposed to pay attention. Servers aren't part of the game. We refill drinks, we smile, and we leave before anyone remembers our names. But something about the atmosphere that night felt different, like the room was holding its breath. I noticed it first when the floor manager suddenly stood straighter and smoothed his tie, eyes moving toward the entrance as if someone important had arrived. Then the security staff shifted positions, subtle but deliberate, like chess pieces moving across a board. I followed their gaze without meaning to, and that's when I saw him. He walked in without rushing, tall and composed, wearing a dark suit that looked custom-made, the kind that fits so perfectly it almost seems effortless. His hair was black, brushed back neatly, and his eyes moved across the room in a quiet sweep that made people instinctively step aside. I didn't know his name yet, but I could feel something change in the air as he passed. Conversations lowered. Dealers straightened their shoulders. Even the musicians in the lounge seemed to soften their notes. He didn't smile or greet anyone. He simply walked toward the poker table like a man who already owned the building. I tried to focus on my tray, reminding myself that this was none of my business. A server who listens too closely doesn't last long in places like this. Still, when I approached the table to set down fresh glasses of water, I felt his gaze for the first time. It wasn't rude or lingering. It was observant, calm, almost analytical, like he was memorizing the room. For a brief second our eyes met. His were a cool shade of gray, steady and unreadable. Then he looked back to the cards as if nothing had happened. The dealer shuffled the deck again, the soft sound of cards sliding against felt echoing under the chandelier. Chips stacked higher than anything I had ever seen formed quiet towers across the table. I stepped back, ready to disappear like I always did, but one of the players laughed too loudly and nudged his stack of chips forward with careless confidence. "Let's make this interesting tonight," he said, voice thick with expensive whiskey. The dealer hesitated, glancing toward the man who had just arrived. The stranger leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers resting lightly on the table, perfectly calm. Then he spoke for the first time, his voice low but clear enough that the entire table went silent. "Interesting," he repeated slowly, as if considering the word. His hand moved forward, placing a single chip into the center of the table. The dealer looked down, and even from where I stood a few feet away, I could see the engraved number. $100 million. And suddenly, the quiet casino felt like the center of the world. The dealer did not move for a full second after the chip touched the felt, as if the number engraved into the polished surface needed time to become real, and the quiet around the table deepened into something heavier than silence. I stood near the edge of the VIP area holding an empty tray against my waist, pretending to wait for someone to ask for another drink, but every instinct told me that something unusual had just begun. The man across the table from the stranger leaned forward slowly, his smile fading as he studied the chip resting in the center of the table. $100 million was not a casual bet, not even in a place where people regularly risked fortunes before midnight. It was the kind of number that changed the atmosphere of an entire room. The player cleared his throat and laughed again, but this time the sound carried a thin edge of uncertainty. The dealer finally nodded and began dealing the next hand. The cards sliding across the green felt in smooth arcs that looked almost graceful under the chandelier light. No one spoke for a few seconds. Chips clicked quietly as bets were matched. I could feel the tension from several feet away, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. The stranger remained perfectly calm, sitting back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone. His eyes moved from the cards to the table and occasionally toward the players around him, measuring, calculating, never hurried. When his gaze briefly passed over me again, I quickly looked down at my tray, reminding myself that servers were invisible in rooms like this. Still, I felt something strange in that moment, as if he had noticed far more than he let on. The hand continued. Cards revealed. Another round of chips pushed forward. The man who had joked earlier leaned back and wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief, suddenly less confident than before. The stranger spoke again, his voice steady and quiet. Raise. He placed another stack of chips forward with the same calm precision, and the dealer counted them carefully before announcing the total. Around the table, the other players exchanged glances that lasted just a little too long. This was no longer an ordinary game. I noticed the floor manager standing several yards away pretending to check a tablet while actually watching every movement at the table. 2 security staff members had positioned themselves near the entrance to the VIP section, their expressions polite but attentive. Even the bartender across the room seemed to slow down while polishing a glass. Everyone felt it now, the strange gravity that surrounded the man in the dark suit. The cards turned again. One player folded. Another hesitated before reluctantly pushing his chips forward to stay in the game. The stranger did not celebrate when he revealed his hand a moment later. He simply nodded once as the dealer pushed the growing mountain of chips toward him. It was the quiet confidence that made it unsettling. He was not gambling the way other people gambled. He was observing, choosing, deciding, like someone who had already calculated every possible outcome before the first card had even touched the table. The man across from him leaned back in his chair and studied him carefully now. There was curiosity in his eyes, but also something else. A realization that he might be sitting across from someone far more dangerous than he had first assumed. I should have walked away then. My shift still had hours left, and there were dozens of other tables that needed service. But something kept me there at the edge of the room, watching the quiet rhythm of the cards and chips while the rain continued tapping softly against the tall glass windows behind the casino floor. Because somehow I could feel it deep in my chest. The night was still just beginning. I should have walked away after the last hand ended, but the strange gravity around that table kept pulling my attention back like a magnet. The dealer gathered the cards again with the same careful movements, his fingers steady even though the pile of chips in front of the man in the dark suit had grown into something that looked less like a stack of money and more like a monument. The rain outside continued sliding down the tall glass windows of the casino, streaking the neon lights into long lines of color that reflected across the polished marble floor. The player across from him shifted in his chair and leaned back slowly, studying the stranger with a more serious expression now. The careless confidence from earlier had faded. People who spend enough time around high-stakes tables learned how to recognize certain signs. Calm breathing, steady hands, the quiet patience of someone who was not chasing luck. The man across the table tried to laugh again, but it sounded forced this time. He tapped his fingers on the edge of the table and glanced toward me standing nearby. "Hey, sweetheart," he said with a crooked grin that was clearly meant to impress the others. "Bring me another bourbon." I nodded automatically and turned toward the bar, grateful for an excuse to step away from the strange tension building around the table. The bartender poured the drink without asking questions and slid the glass across the counter. I carried it back carefully, heels clicking softly against the floor as the music from the lounge drifted through the room. When I reached the table, the man lifted the glass and took a slow sip before leaning forward again. "You know what would make this game interesting?" he said, looking around at the other players with a mischievous smile that was starting to feel uncomfortable. The dealer paused slightly, sensing something unusual in the tone. The man gestured loosely in my direction with the hand holding the glass. "Her." The word hung in the air like a mistake that had already been made. I froze for a fraction of a second, unsure if I had heard correctly. One of the other players frowned and shook his head slightly, but the man continued speaking as if it were the most ordinary suggestion in the world. "Let us say the next hand decides something different." He leaned forward, sliding a stack of chips into the center of the table with exaggerated confidence. "If I lose, I cover the whole amount with cash tonight. If I win, He nodded toward me again with a careless wave. The lady joins me for dinner. It was meant to sound charming, like a harmless joke in a room full of wealthy men. But the silence that followed told a different story. The dealer glanced toward the floor manager. The other players shifted in their seats. I felt heat rise into my face. Not from embarrassment, but from the sudden awareness that the room had quietly turned toward the man in the dark suit. He had not moved when the suggestion was made. His posture remained relaxed, one hand resting lightly against the table, the other holding a single chip between his fingers. For a moment, he simply watched the man across from him with an expression that revealed nothing at all. Then his eyes moved slowly toward me, standing beside the table with the empty tray in my hands. The gaze was calm, steady, almost thoughtful. Finally, he looked back at the player who had spoken and placed the chip down on the felt with a soft sound that somehow carried through the entire room. "No," he said quietly. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that did not need to be repeated. The man blinked in surprise and opened his mouth as if to argue. But the stranger spoke again before he could finish. "People are not part of the game." The silence deepened. For a moment no one moved. Then the stranger reached forward and pushed a new stack of chips into the center of the table, larger than anything that had appeared there all night. The dealer leaned forward to count them, his eyebrows lifting slightly as he read the number engraved across the top chip. $100 million. The stranger looked directly at the player across from him. "Now the game is interesting." The number rested on the table like a quiet explosion that had not yet finished echoing through the room. $100 million. Even in a casino built for excess, that amount carried weight. The dealer inhaled slowly and began shuffling the deck again, his movements careful and deliberate, as if every motion needed to be precise under the invisible spotlight that had suddenly fallen over the table. No one laughed anymore. The man who had made the careless suggestion earlier stared at the chips now sitting in the center of the felt, his earlier confidence fading into something tighter around the edges. I remained standing beside the table with my empty tray pressed lightly against my waist, unsure whether I should step away or stay exactly where I was. The stranger had not looked at me again since placing the bet. Instead, he watched the cards being shuffled with the same calm patience he had shown all night. The rain continued sliding down the glass walls of the casino, and somewhere in the distance the soft piano from the lounge floated through the air like background music in a movie scene that had suddenly become far more serious. The dealer began to deal the cards one by one. Each card landed with a soft whisper against the felt. The man across from the stranger studied his hand and swallowed before forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "That is a very generous wager," he said slowly. The stranger tilted his head slightly. "It is not a wager," he replied. "It is a correction." The player blinked, unsure how to respond. Around the table the other men exchanged quiet glances. They had entered the game expecting excitement and perhaps a little spectacle. What they were witnessing now felt more like a lesson. Chips moved across the table again as the betting round began. The man pushed a stack forward with visible hesitation. The dealer announced the amount. The stranger matched it without a word, sliding chips forward with an almost absent-minded motion. His gray eyes remained steady, not on the chips, but on the man across from him. The hand continued. Cards revealed. Another round of bets placed. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, even though I was not part of the game. Something about the way the stranger played made it impossible to look away. He was not chasing the thrill the way other gamblers did. He was waiting, observing, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere long before the cards were even dealt. The final card touched the table. The dealer looked at the players. The man across from the stranger stared at his hand for several seconds before slowly laying the cards down. The dealer revealed the stranger's hand next, and then pushed the mountain of chips toward him. The result was clear. The man exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as the reality of the loss settled in. $100 million had just changed direction across a table in under 5 minutes. The stranger did not celebrate. He simply gathered the chips into neat stacks, his movements calm and controlled. Then he stood. For the first time since the game had begun, he looked directly at me again. The expression in his eyes was not triumph. It was something quieter, more deliberate. He reached into his jacket and placed a small black card on the table in front of the man who had lost. "Your debt is settled," he said evenly. Then he turned slightly toward me, his voice soft, but unmistakably clear. "Miss Bennett, you are no longer part of anyone's bet tonight." The words froze me in place. I had never told him my name. The floor manager stared in stunned silence while the other players remained seated, processing what had just happened. The stranger adjusted the cuff of his jacket and began walking toward the exit of the VIP section. Security moved instinctively to clear the path. As he passed me, he paused for half a second and spoke in a voice low enough that only I could hear. "You should go home early tonight, Olivia." The rain outside had grown heavier by the time he disappeared through the doors, and somehow I knew the night was far from over. For several seconds after he walked away, I simply stood there with the tray in my hands, trying to process what had just happened while the room slowly began to breathe again. Conversations returned in low murmurs. Chips moved. Glasses clinked somewhere behind me. But the atmosphere around the table had changed completely, like a storm had passed through and left the air strangely clear. The man who had lost leaned back in his chair and stared at the black card still resting on the felt in front of him. No one spoke to him. The other players quietly gathered their chips and signaled the dealer that the game was over. I finally forced myself to move, turning toward the service hallway behind the bar as my heart continued beating faster than it should have. My shift was supposed to end in 3 hours, but my mind kept replaying the moment the stranger had spoken my name. I had never told him. Not once. Inside the staff hallway, the noise of the casino faded into a distant hum. I leaned against the cool wall for a second and exhaled slowly, trying to calm the strange mixture of confusion and curiosity building in my chest. "Olivia, what happened out there?" The voice belonged to Megan, another server finishing her own shift. She stepped closer, her eyes wide with curiosity. I shook my head lightly. "Just a strange game," I said, though the explanation sounded weak even to my own ears. Megan raised an eyebrow but did not push further. The casino floor had seen stranger things than high-stakes poker hands. Still, the question lingered in my mind. Who was he? When I returned to the main floor a few minutes later, the rain outside had intensified. Water streamed down the tall glass walls like silver ribbons while the neon lights of the Las Vegas Strip shimmered through the storm. The VIP section had nearly emptied. Only the floor manager and a few staff members remained, quietly discussing paperwork from the massive transaction that had just taken place. The chair where the stranger had been sitting was empty now, but the memory of his calm presence still felt strangely real, like a shadow that had not fully disappeared. I finished clearing the table and returned the empty glasses to the bar before checking the time on the small watch around my wrist. It was just past 11:30. Normally, I would still have hours left before closing, but his quiet words echoed again in my mind. "You should go home early tonight." The suggestion felt odd coming from someone I had met only minutes earlier. Still, something about the certainty in his voice made it difficult to ignore. I walked to the office and spoke with the floor manager, explaining that I was not feeling well. He studied me for a moment, perhaps remembering the unusual scene at the poker table earlier, then nodded without argument. 15 minutes later, I stepped outside into the cool night air beneath the covered entrance of the casino. The rain had softened into a gentle drizzle, and the bright lights of the Strip reflected off the wet pavement like liquid gold. Taxis lined the curb, while luxury cars moved slowly through the traffic circle. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and began walking toward the employee parking garage across the street. The night felt quieter out here, almost peaceful compared to the constant noise inside the casino. I had just reached the edge of the crosswalk when a long black car rolled smoothly to a stop beside the curb near me. The engine hummed quietly as the rear door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out and offered a polite nod. "Miss Bennett," he said calmly, "Mr. Vale would like to offer you a ride home." For a moment, I simply stood there under the soft glow of the streetlights, staring at the open door of the car while the rain tapped lightly against the pavement around my feet. I hesitated under the soft glow of the streetlight, the rain tapping lightly against the pavement while the open door of the long black car waited beside me like a quiet invitation I had not asked for. The man standing next to it wore a dark suit that looked almost identical to the ones I had seen around the poker table earlier, his posture straight and patient, his expression calm, as if he had done this many times before. "Mr. Vale asked me to make sure you arrived home safely," he said politely, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone delivering instructions that were not meant to be questioned. I glanced at the empty street for a moment. Cars moved slowly through the glowing traffic circle in front of the casino, their headlights reflecting across the wet asphalt. Part of me wanted to refuse immediately. I had grown up learning that accepting rides from strangers was never a good idea, especially in a city like Las Vegas where stories traveled quickly and not all of them ended well. But another part of me remembered the calm certainty in Sebastian Vale's voice earlier that night. "You should go home early tonight, Olivia." The fact that he knew my name still felt unsettling. I folded my arms slightly against the cool air and looked back at the driver. How does he know where I live? The driver did not smile, but his answer came smoothly. "Mr. Vale does not intend to inconvenience you, Miss Bennett. If you prefer, we can take you anywhere you choose." The rain had grown slightly heavier again, soft drops tapping against the roof of the car, while a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the desert sky. Standing there in the middle of the quiet street, I suddenly realized how tired I was. My shift had started hours earlier, and the emotional weight of the night still sat heavily in my chest. I exhaled slowly and nodded. "Just take me to the employee garage," I said. "My car is there." "Of course," the driver replied immediately. He stepped aside and held the door open as I climbed into the back seat. The interior of the car was warm and softly lit, the leather seat smooth and comfortable beneath my coat. The door closed with a quiet sound that sealed the outside world away, and a moment later the car began moving smoothly through the traffic circle. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The city lights of the Las Vegas Strip drifted past the windows in bright waves of color, while the rain blurred the neon signs into glowing reflections. Finally, curiosity overcame my hesitation. "Is Mr. Vale always this generous with strangers?" I asked, my voice careful but steady. The driver glanced briefly at me through the mirror. "Mr. Vale does not consider you a stranger, Miss Bennett." That answer only created more questions. I leaned back slightly in the seat and watched the passing lights while the car turned toward the quieter street that led to the employee parking garage across from the casino. A few minutes later, the car slowed to a stop beside the entrance. I reached for the door handle, ready to step out, when the driver spoke again. "One moment, please." He reached forward and opened a small compartment in the center console before handing something back to me. A simple white envelope rested in his hand. "Mr. Vale asked me to give you this." I took the envelope slowly, my fingers brushing the smooth paper while the rain continued tapping softly against the windows. There was no name written on it, no markings at all, just a quiet weight in my hand that felt strangely important. The driver waited patiently while I looked down at it. For a moment I considered refusing it, handing it back and walking away from the entire strange evening. But curiosity won again. I opened the envelope carefully and slid out the single card inside. It was the same black card I had seen on the poker table earlier that night, except now a small line of silver lettering had been added beneath the name. Sebastian Vale. Underneath the name was a single handwritten sentence. "You were never the prize tonight." I sat there in the quiet car staring at the words while the rain continued falling outside, realizing that the mysterious night I thought was ending might actually be just beginning. I remained in the back seat of the car for a moment longer, staring at the black card in my hand while the rain continued tapping softly against the windows like a quiet rhythm that matched the strange thoughts running through my mind. "You were never the prize tonight." The sentence repeated itself over and over in my head, simple words written in steady handwriting that somehow carried more weight than the massive stacks of chips I had seen earlier on the poker table. I finally slipped the card back into the envelope and opened the door. The cool night air brushed against my face as I stepped out into the dim lighting of the employee parking garage across the street from the casino. The driver remained seated, giving a polite nod before the door closed and the long black car quietly rolled away into the rainy night. For a few seconds I simply stood there watching the tail lights disappear down the street, feeling as if the entire evening had unfolded like a scene from someone else's life. My car sat in the far corner of the garage where I always parked during my shifts, an aging silver sedan that had survived more than a few years of late-night drives across the city. I walked toward it slowly, the echo of my footsteps bouncing softly off the concrete walls while the distant noise of the Las Vegas Strip hummed somewhere beyond the garage entrance. When I reached the driver's door, I paused again, pulling the envelope from my coat pocket and looking at it one more time under the pale fluorescent lights above. Sebastian Vale. The name felt unfamiliar and yet strangely important, like something I should have recognized but could not quite place. I opened the car door and slid into the seat, setting the envelope carefully on the passenger side before starting the engine. The radio came alive with a quiet late-night jazz station, the music drifting through the car while I pulled slowly out of the garage and turned onto the wide boulevard that led away from the casino district. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving the streets glossy and reflective under the glow of neon signs and towering hotel lights. Las Vegas at night always looked like a place where anything could happen, but tonight the city felt different to me. Quieter somehow, as if I had stepped into a story that had been unfolding long before I ever arrived. The drive home usually took about 15 minutes. I passed familiar landmarks along the way, small diners still open for the late crowd, glowing gas stations, and rows of palm trees swaying gently in the desert wind. But my mind kept drifting back to the moment at the poker table. The calm voice, the steady eyes, the quiet way he had said people were not part of the game. Most men with that kind of money did not speak that way. When I finally pulled into the parking lot outside my apartment building, the sky had begun to clear. The clouds were drifting away from the city, revealing a scattering of bright desert stars above the rooftops. I parked the car and turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment in the sudden silence. My apartment building was small and unremarkable, the kind of place that blended into the endless rows of buildings on the edge of the city. I grabbed the envelope again before stepping out of the car and heading inside. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and someone cooking late-night noodles down the hall. My door clicked open and I stepped into the quiet space I called home, kicking off my shoes and setting the envelope down on the kitchen table beneath the soft yellow light. I should have gone to sleep immediately after such a long shift, but curiosity refused to let the night in so easily. I opened my laptop and typed the name slowly into the search bar. Sebastian Vale. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then the screen filled with articles, headlines, and photographs that made my heart beat faster as I began to read. The man who had calmly placed $100 million on a poker table tonight was not simply another wealthy visitor in Las Vegas. According to the glowing screen in front of me, Sebastian Vale was one of the most powerful and mysterious figures connected to the international casino industry, a man whose business interests stretched across cities and continents. I leaned back slowly in my chair, staring at the photograph on the screen that showed the same calm gray eyes I had seen across the poker table only hours earlier. And suddenly the sentence on the card made a little more sense. Because men like Sebastian Vale did not usually spend fortunes to make a point. They spent them when something truly mattered. I sat in the quiet glow of my laptop screen long after midnight, scrolling slowly through articles and business profiles that all repeated the same name with an almost strange consistency. Sebastian Vale. Every headline seemed to describe him with a mixture of admiration and caution, the kind of tone journalists use when they are writing about someone powerful enough to attract attention, but private enough that very little is truly known. One article described him as a visionary investor who had quietly acquired ownership stakes in several luxury casino resorts across the world. Another mentioned his involvement in large international developments that had transformed entire districts in cities like Monaco and Singapore. None of them mentioned poker tables or $100 million bets, and yet the photograph on the screen showed the same calm gray eyes I had seen earlier that night. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my temples, trying to make sense of how someone with that kind of influence had ended up sitting across a poker table from a man making careless jokes about a cocktail server. The apartment around me was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside on the distant street. My shift at the casino had ended hours ago, but sleep felt impossible now. Curiosity had taken over completely. I clicked through another article and paused when I saw a short interview from a business conference 2 years earlier. The reporter had asked Sebastian Vale why he avoided publicity despite controlling billions of dollars in investments. His answer had been simple. Influence works better when it does not need attention. I stared at the sentence for a moment before closing the browser window halfway. The words sounded exactly like something he would say in person. Calm, direct, almost quiet. I glanced toward the kitchen table where the envelope still rested under the soft yellow light. The black card sat beside it now, the silver letters catching the glow whenever I moved. Sebastian Vale, you were never the prize tonight. The sentence carried a strange sense of intention that I could not quite explain. Finally, I closed the laptop and stood up, stretching my arms as the clock on the microwave changed to 1:30 in the morning. I should have gone to bed hours ago, but my thoughts still circled the same questions. Why had he intervened at the poker table? Why had he spent that kind of money just to stop a careless comment? And most of all, why had he gone out of his way to send that message afterward? I poured a glass of water and leaned against the kitchen counter, staring through the small window above the sink at the quiet parking lot outside. The rain had stopped completely now. The asphalt reflected the soft glow of the streetlights while the desert air felt cool and calm. The city never truly slept, but this late hour carried a rare kind of stillness. I turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the bedroom, planning to finally get some rest before the next day began. My phone buzzed softly on the table behind me just as I reached the doorway. The sound made me pause. I walked back slowly and picked it up. The screen showed a single message from an unknown number. For a second, I simply stared at it, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. Then I opened the message. "Good evening, Olivia. I hope you arrived home safely." The calm tone of the words felt familiar immediately. I did not recognize the number, but somehow I already knew exactly who had sent it. I stared at the message glowing on my phone screen while the quiet apartment seemed to shrink around me. "Good evening, Olivia. I hope you arrived home safely." The words were simple, almost polite, but the calm tone behind them felt unmistakable. I read the message again, half expecting another explanation to appear underneath it, but the screen remained silent except for the blinking cursor waiting for a reply. For a moment I did nothing. I simply stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, the black card still resting on the table beside me, trying to understand why someone like Sebastian Vale would be sending a message to someone like me in the middle of the night. My first instinct was not to answer at all. People with that kind of power did not usually enter ordinary conversations, and I had learned a long time ago that curiosity could sometimes lead to complicated places. But the longer I stared at the message, the more impossible it became to ignore it. Finally, I typed a short response. "Yes. Thank you for the ride." I hesitated before pressing send, then tapped the screen. The message disappeared into the quiet digital space between us. I placed the phone down on the table and waited, not entirely sure why I expected an answer so quickly. The seconds stretched into a full minute. Then the phone vibrated softly again. I picked it up. "I am glad to hear that." His reply appeared almost immediately, as if he had been watching the screen the same way I had. For several seconds, I studied the words, wondering what someone like Sebastian Vale might want from a conversation that had begun with a poker table and $100 million. Another message appeared before I could decide what to say next. "I apologize if tonight placed you in an uncomfortable position. The situation required a quick decision." I leaned back slightly against the kitchen counter while reading the sentence again. It did not sound like the message of someone trying to impress anyone. It sounded more like a quiet explanation. I typed slowly. Most people would not spend that kind of money to correct a joke. The message sent. The reply came after a brief pause. Most people would not turn a person into part of a game. The answer was so direct that it made me smile slightly despite the strange situation. I walked over to the window while holding the phone, looking out across the quiet parking lot where the streetlights reflected on the wet pavement. The city beyond my apartment remained bright and restless even this late at night. I typed again before I could overthink the moment. "So that was your reason." A long pause followed. This time, almost a full minute passed before the phone vibrated again. Not entirely. I frowned slightly while reading the new message. There was another reason. My curiosity returned immediately. I sat down at the small kitchen table and typed the question that had been forming in my mind since the poker table hours earlier. What was the other reason? The typing indicator appeared on the screen for several seconds before the reply arrived. "Because some things should never be bought." I stared at the sentence quietly. The calm certainty in the words felt exactly like the tone he had used earlier when he told the table that people were not part of the game. Outside the window, the wind shifted gently through the palm trees lining the street. I looked down at the black card on the table and then back at the phone. A final message appeared before I could respond again. "Good night, Olivia. Tomorrow will be a quieter day for both of us." I lowered the phone slowly, realizing that somehow a conversation had begun that neither of us had expected when the night started. I remained seated at the kitchen table for a long time after the final message appeared on my phone. "Good night, Olivia." Tomorrow will be a quieter day for both of us. The screen dimmed slowly in my hand while the apartment returned to its quiet late-night stillness. For a few seconds I considered replying again, asking more questions about the strange evening or the mysterious reason he had mentioned earlier, but something about the calm finality of his message made me pause. It felt less like the end of a conversation and more like the closing of a door that might open again later. I placed the phone beside the black card on the table and leaned back in my chair, letting out a long breath I had not realized I was holding. Outside the window, the clouds had completely cleared, leaving the sky above Las Vegas bright with stars that were usually hidden behind the glow of the city lights. The silence of the apartment felt heavier now that the night had finally slowed down. I stood up and turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the small lamp in the living room casting a warm circle across the floor. My body reminded me suddenly how late it had become. The clock on the wall read 2:15 in the morning. My next shift at the casino did not begin until late afternoon, which meant I had a few hours to sleep before the city started moving again. I picked up the black card one more time before heading to bed. Sebastian Vale. The silver lettering reflected softly under the lamp. It was strange how a single name could suddenly connect so many moments from one evening. The poker table. The calm voice. The message on my phone. I set the card carefully on the nightstand beside my bed before finally turning off the lamp and lying down. The quiet darkness of the room felt almost peaceful after the constant lights and noise of the casino floor. I closed my eyes, expecting my thoughts to continue racing, but exhaustion slowly pulled me into sleep. When morning arrived, the sunlight spilling through the curtains felt almost unfamiliar after the long night before. I blinked slowly and reached for my phone, half expecting another message to be waiting there. The screen remained empty except for a few ordinary notifications from news apps and the weather forecast. For a moment, I wondered if the entire evening had simply been an unusual dream created by too many hours under bright casino lights. Then I turned my head and saw the black card resting on the nightstand. The memory returned immediately. I got out of bed and walked to the kitchen, starting the coffee maker while the morning news played quietly from the television in the living room. The city looked ordinary again in the daylight. Cars moved along the boulevard. Neighbors walked their dogs across the apartment parking lot. Everything seemed normal, and yet something about the day felt slightly different. I carried the coffee mug to the small balcony outside my apartment and leaned against the railing while the warm desert air drifted across the quiet street below. My phone buzzed softly on the table behind me. The sound made me turn around immediately. I walked back inside and picked it up. The message came from the same unknown number as the night before. "Good morning, Olivia. I hope you slept well." I read the words slowly, a small smile forming before I could stop it. The quiet day he had promised had apparently already begun. I stood in the quiet kitchen holding my phone while the morning sunlight drifted through the balcony doors and spilled across the floor in long golden lines. "Good morning, Olivia. I hope you slept well." The message felt almost strangely normal compared to the chaos of the night before, as if the man who had placed $100 million on a poker table could also begin a day with something as simple as a polite greeting. I looked at the screen for a moment before typing a response. "I slept better than expected. Thank you." I hesitated before adding another line. "I hope your day is quieter than last night." I pressed send and set the phone on the counter while pouring fresh coffee into my mug. Outside, the city had fully awakened. Traffic moved steadily down the boulevard, and the desert sun had already begun warming the sidewalks and rooftops. Las Vegas looked ordinary in the morning light, nothing like the glowing spectacle it became after sunset. My phone vibrated again almost immediately. "It appears you survived the evening without too much trouble," the message read. I smiled slightly at the screen before replying. Survived is the correct word. Most nights at the casino are not that dramatic. A few seconds passed before the next message arrived. "That is good to hear. I would prefer if the next time we speak it is not. Because someone made a foolish decision at a poker table." The words made me pause for a moment. "Next time." The phrase felt casual, but carried a quiet certainty behind it. I leaned against the kitchen counter and typed again. "You assume there will be a next time." The typing indicator appeared on the screen almost immediately. "I rarely assume anything, Olivia. I simply notice when something unusual happens." I read the sentence twice before responding. "And last night was unusual." There was a longer pause this time before his answer arrived. Yes, not because of the money. The simplicity of the statement made me glance toward the black card resting on the table beside the coffee mug. I picked it up absent-mindedly while reading the next message that followed a moment later. Most people do not realize when they are standing in the middle of a moment that might matter later. I turned the card slowly between my fingers while thinking about the poker table, the calm voice across the felt, and the strange way the entire room had gone silent when he spoke. My phone vibrated again before I could type a reply. I will be in Las Vegas for the next few days. Business meetings mostly. His message paused there before the next one appeared. If you would ever like to see the city from somewhere quieter than a casino floor, I would be glad to offer a better introduction. I stared at the screen for several seconds. The invitation was written simply, almost formally, without any pressure behind it. I walked out onto the balcony with my phone and coffee mug, while the warm desert breeze moved gently through the palm trees below. From here I could see the distant towers of the casino district shimmering in the sunlight. A city built on risk and chance. I looked back at the message one more time before typing my answer slowly. I suppose a quieter introduction might be interesting. The reply came quickly this time. Then we will find a quiet place. The conversation ended there, but as I stood on the balcony watching the city move through its ordinary morning, I had the strange feeling that the story that began at a poker table had only just started to unfold. I remained on the balcony for a long moment after the conversation ended, the warm morning air brushing gently across the quiet street while the city continued moving through its ordinary rhythm below. The message on my phone still glowed softly in my hand. Then we will find a quiet place. It sounded simple, almost casual, but the thought of meeting Sebastian Vale outside the strange atmosphere of a casino floor felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. I finished the last sip of coffee and stepped back inside the apartment, setting the mug in the sink while the morning news continued speaking quietly from the television. The day moved forward like any other. I answered a few emails from my online college classes, watered the small plant near the window, and tried to focus on ordinary tasks that usually filled the quiet hours before my shift at the casino. But every now and then my eyes drifted toward the black card still resting on the kitchen table. The silver letters reflected the sunlight whenever I passed by. Sebastian Vale. The name carried a different meaning now than it had the night before. Not just a powerful stranger at a poker table, but someone who had started a conversation that refused to leave my thoughts. Around noon my phone vibrated again. I glanced at the screen while sitting on the couch. I have a meeting this afternoon near the northern end of the strip, the message read. Afterward I will have some time. There was a short pause before the next line appeared. If you are free later today, there is a quiet restaurant overlooking the valley that I think you might enjoy. I leaned back slowly while reading the message again. The invitation still carried that same calm tone, never demanding, never assuming. I typed a careful reply. I start work at the casino this evening, but I am free for a few hours before my shift. The response came within seconds. That will be perfect. The place is called Solara Terrace. It sits on a ridge outside the city lights. The sunset there is worth the drive. I smiled slightly at the screen before typing again. You seem very confident about the view. The typing indicator appeared again. I am confident that some places are better appreciated away from the noise of a casino. The answer made me laugh quietly. I set the phone down and stood up, walking toward the bedroom to begin getting ready for the afternoon. For a moment, I paused in front of the mirror, studying my reflection with mild disbelief. 24 hours earlier my life had been moving through its usual routine of classes and late-night shifts serving drinks to strangers. Now I was preparing to meet a man whose name filled business headlines across half the world. I chose a simple outfit that felt comfortable rather than formal, something that would not make the moment feel like a business meeting or a date. Just a conversation between two people who had met under unusual circumstances. When I stepped outside the apartment building later that afternoon, the desert sun hung low over the distant mountains, casting long golden shadows across the quiet streets. I started the engine of my car and glanced once more at the message with the restaurant address glowing on the phone screen beside me. The drive would take about 20 minutes. As I pulled onto the road leading toward the edge of the city, I realized something unexpected. For the first time since the strange poker game the night before, I was not thinking about the money or the mystery surrounding Sebastian Vale. I was simply curious about the person who had calmly said that some things should never be bought. I reached the ridge just as the sun began lowering toward the horizon, the desert sky turning shades of amber and soft crimson that stretched across the wide valley outside Las Vegas. The city lights had not yet fully awakened, leaving the landscape strangely calm compared to the glowing chaos of the strip behind me. Solara Terrace sat quietly along the edge of the ridge, its glass walls reflecting the sunset, while a few early guests sat at tables overlooking the endless desert below. I parked the car and stepped out into the warm evening air, the soft breeze carrying the scent of desert plants and distant rain from somewhere beyond the mountains. For a moment, I simply stood there, taking into view exactly the way Sebastian had described it. Some places really were better appreciated away from the noise. As I walked toward the entrance of the terrace restaurant, I noticed him immediately. Sebastian Vale stood near the railing overlooking the valley, his dark suit jacket draped casually over one shoulder, while the fading sunlight outlined his silhouette against the horizon. He turned slightly as I approached, as if he had sensed my arrival before hearing my footsteps. For a second, neither of us spoke. The quiet desert wind moved through the space between us, while the last light of the sun reflected in his calm gray eyes. "I am glad you came, Olivia," he said finally, his voice carrying the same quiet steadiness I remembered from the poker table. I glanced toward the valley stretching endlessly below the ridge before answering. "I can see why you recommended this place. It is beautiful." He followed my gaze across the horizon and nodded once. "Some views are worth stepping away from the noise for." We stood there for a moment longer, watching the sky shift slowly into deeper shades of gold and violet as the city lights began flickering to life far below. The silence between us felt comfortable rather than awkward, which surprised me more than anything else about the evening. Finally, I turned slightly toward him. "You still have not explained something from last night." His expression shifted just enough to show curiosity. "Which part?" I folded my arms lightly against the cool evening breeze. "You spent $100 million to correct a moment that most people would have ignored." I paused for a moment before finishing the thought. "Why?" Sebastian studied the horizon quietly before answering. "Because sometimes a moment reveals what kind of world people are willing to accept." His voice remained calm, almost reflective. "If no one objects when something is wrong, it becomes normal." I watched him carefully while the last light of the sunset faded behind the mountains. "And you decided that moment mattered." He turned slightly toward me, his expression thoughtful but certain. "Yes." Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a familiar black card before placing it gently on the table beside us. The same silver lettering reflected under the terrace lights. "Sebastian Vale. I believe I promised you a quieter introduction to the city," he said with a faint smile. I looked at the card, and then back toward the glowing skyline of Las Vegas beginning to sparkle in the distance. Somehow the moment felt larger than a conversation between two people who had met less than 24 hours earlier. Because the strange truth was already clear in my mind. The night that began with a poker table. And $100 million decision had never really been about money at all. It had been about something far rarer in a city built on chance. A choice.